In southeastern Iran, where the Lut Desert pushes the thermometer beyond 70 degrees on the surface of the ground, there is a place that should not exist. A cluster of low hills, covered by a whitish crust, rises between 12 and 18 meters above the desert plain. From a distance, they look like natural formations, mounds of compacted earth, battered by the wind, forgotten by time. They are not. Beneath that layer of salt and silence, an entire city slept for 4,000 years. A metropolis of 200 hectares with residential neighborhoods, specialized industrial quarters, a monumental area with thick-walled buildings, a cemetery with tens of thousands of tombs, and more than 2 million objects preserved under 20 centimeters of compacted ash. No road sign, no tourist map, no marker on the highway indicates the scale of what is buried there. To put it in perspective, the total area of this site is larger than many entire medieval European cities. And perhaps the most disturbing thing is not the size of this city, it is what they found inside it. Archaeologists call it Shahr-e-Sukhteh. In Persian, the name means burnt city. The name is not metaphorical. The city was literally set on fire 3 times during its existence, and the burn marks that a British colonel observed in the region 150 years ago, upon seeing piles of ash scattered across the landscape, ended up giving the site this somber baptism. And the story of how it was found, of what it hid beneath tons of hardened ash, and of what it still hides, is one of the most extraordinary narratives of modern archaeology. Because this is not just an ancient city, it is a city that does not fit any known model of civilization. A city without kings, without temples, without weapons, and without walls. A city that invented animation, brain surgery, and the prosthetic eye millennia before any other place on the planet recorded any of those things. And then it vanished from the map, as if it had never existed. Let us go inside. The first person to consciously step on the ruins of Shahr-e-Sukhteh and understand that there was something extraordinary beneath their feet was Sir Aurel Stein, a Hungarian-British archaeologist who spent his entire life mapping ancient routes across the Middle East and Central Asia. Stein was already over 60 years old when he arrived in the Sistan region, on the border between Iran and Afghanistan, during his 4th and final great expedition between 1935 and 1936. He traveled accompanied by the Iranian archaeologist Bahram Karimi, and both traversed the arid terrain in search of prehistoric settlements along the ancient trade routes that had crossed the Iranian plateau for millennia. When Stein spotted the low hills covered in ash and fragments of pottery scattered across the surface, he knew immediately that he was facing something significant. Decades of experience traversing archaeological sites from Egypt to China told him that mound was not natural, but he worked at the site for only 4 days. He collected surface samples, made detailed notes in his notebooks, and continued his journey. The hills returned to silence. The desert swallowed again what had been briefly touched. And here begins the most frustrating part of this story. 30 years passed before anyone came back. 3 entire decades in which the city continued sleeping under the ash, while the world went through a world war, the reconstruction of Europe, the birth of new nations. It was only in 1967 that a team from the Italian Institute for Africa and the Orient, led by archaeologist Maurizio Tosi, began the first official and systematic excavations at Shahr-e-Sukhteh. The Italian team worked for 11 consecutive years, completing 10 excavation seasons that grew ever deeper and ever more revealing. And each layer they removed made the mystery greater, not smaller. Because the artifacts that began to emerge from the earth did not resemble anything found in neighboring civilizations of the same era. The ceramics had their own styles and unmistakable techniques. The construction methods followed patterns independent of anything known in Mesopotamia. The commercial connections extended in every direction. from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, from Central Asia to the Persian Gulf, but the material culture was unmistakably singular. Tosi and his team began to realize they were not simply excavating an ancient city. They were unearthing an entire civilization that had operated independently of Mesopotamia, the official cradle of civilization. This challenged everything that was known about the origin of complex societies in the Middle East. Then, in 1978, the Iranian Revolution erupted. The borders closed, the visas were cancelled, and the archaeological site remained untouched for 19 years. Nearly 2 decades of absolute silence. The desert winds swept the trenches opened by the Italian team. The sand covered what had been exposed with so much patience. Shari Sukte went back to sleep, as if the earth itself refused to reveal its secrets before their time. It was only in 1997 that excavations were resumed, this time under the leadership of Iranian archaeologist Sayed Mansour Sajadi and his team from the Cultural Heritage and Tourism Organization of Iran. And it was from that moment onward that the discoveries truly exploded in scale and significance. To understand the dimension of what we are talking about, one must first imagine the city at its peak. And for that, we need to erase from our minds the current landscape. Shari Sukte was founded around 3200 before Christ on the banks of the Helmand River near Lake Hamun, in a region that 5,000 years ago was completely different from the deadly desert it is today. The climate was humid. There were extensive marshy areas, abundant vegetation, wild animals of every kind, enough water for large-scale irrigation and intensive agriculture. The Helmand River fed canals that distributed water throughout the Sistan Plain, and it was in this fertile setting, almost unrecognizable when compared to the present, that the city was born as a small settlement and grew over centuries to become one of the largest urban agglomerations in the world at the dawn of the urban era. At its peak, the effectively built-up area extended over about 120 hectares, and the total site, including the monumental cemetery and peripheral areas, covered 200 hectares. To put that in a perspective anyone can visualize, the ancient city of Ur in Mesopotamia, one of the most famous and celebrated of the ancient world, covered about 60 hectares. Shari Sukte was more than 3 times larger than Ur. And it was not a chaotic cluster of mud houses piled without planning. Like many settlements of that era, it was a deliberately planned city. And here comes the part that makes modern archaeologists drop their jaws. The city had a functional division of neighborhoods that rivals the urban planning of much more recent metropolises. A monumental area in the northwest, with administrative or ceremonial structures whose walls were more than 1 meter thick. A residential neighborhood in the east, with courtyard houses organized along narrow winding alleys, each residence with clearly separated spaces for living, cooking, and artisanal production. An industrial quarter in the northwest, dedicated exclusively to working with semi-precious stones, especially the valuable lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan. A zone to the south focused on the manufacture of flint tools, and in the southwest, a cemetery of colossal proportions, 25 entire hectares containing between 25,000 and 40,000 individual tombs. Each function of urban life occupied a space deliberately separated from the others, with clear boundaries and planned transitions. This, more than 5,000 years ago, when in most of the planet, human beings still lived in villages of a few dozen huts. The houses varied according to the social status of the residents. Common residences had between 2 and 4 mixed-use rooms, storage areas, and open courtyards for ventilation, designed to accommodate 1 or 2 nuclear families. Larger and more elaborate houses, which archaeologists dubbed special houses, housed extended families, organized in multiple housing units with shared spaces. The hydraulic infrastructure was sophisticated enough to surprise contemporary engineers. The inhabitants channeled the seasonal floods of the Helmand River through a network of canals and reservoirs designed for controlled irrigation, allowing the systematic cultivation of barley and wheat on the Sistan Plain. These water management systems sustained the city's economic stability and population growth for centuries on end. But brace yourself for what comes next, because the discoveries inside the tombs and houses of this city are so extraordinary that when they were presented to the international scientific community, many researchers simply refused to believe them without seeing the evidence with their own eyes. In December of 2006, archaeologists excavating the ancient tombs of Shaha-e-Sukte found something that changed the history of medicine forever. Inside a burial, next to the skeleton of a woman who stood 1 meter and 82 centimeters tall, an extraordinary stature far above the average for any woman of her era, was a hemispherical object just over 2.5 centimeters in diameter. It was an artificial eye, the oldest prosthetic eye ever found in the entire world. Made from a surprisingly lightweight mixture of natural bitumen and animal fat, materials that, when combined, kept the prosthesis moist and durable during prolonged use. Its surface was covered by a thin layer of gold meticulously applied. At the center, an engraved circle represented the iris with remarkable precision, and around it, the finest lines of gold radiated outward like the rays of the sun, mimicking the capillary vessels of a real eye with a fidelity that impressed the modern ophthalmologists who examined the artifact. And do you know what is most impressive? Each gold thread drawn on the surface was less than 0.5 millimeter thick. On both sides of the artificial eye, there were tiny holes through which a soft gold wire passed, keeping the prosthesis firmly in place inside the eye socket. Detailed microscopic research on the inner wall of the woman's skull showed clear and unmistakable marks from the gold wire in the orbit, proving that she wore that eye throughout her entire adult life. It was not a funerary object placed after death as an offering. It was a functional prosthesis used in daily life, probably for decades. The remains of this woman were dated to between 2900 and 2800 before Christ. Nearly 5,000 years ago, in that lost city, in the middle of what is today the most scorching desert on the planet, someone designed, manufactured, and implanted an artificial eye with artistic detail and medical functionality that would not be matched for entire millennia of human history. And that is only the beginning of the list of impossibilities. In the same city, archaeologists found the skull of a girl, approximately 13 years old, that showed clear scars of a trepanation, a complex brain surgery performed to relieve intracranial pressure caused by congenital hydrocephalus. A carefully defined portion of the skull had been removed, with instruments that cut through the bone without shattering it, and analyses by specialists indicate that the young girl survived for considerable months after the procedure. 5,000 years ago, in that city in the middle of what is now a desert where nothing lives, surgeons performed neurosurgeries that required precise anatomical knowledge, adequate instruments, and post-operative care techniques, and their patients survived. And here comes the craziest part of this entire story. It is not just medicine that was millennia ahead of what was expected. In the 1970s, the Italian team led by Maurizio Tossi unearthed from a funerary site a ceramic goblet dated to approximately 3178 before Christ, belonging to period 1 of the city, its oldest phase. On the surface of this goblet was a sequence of 5 images painted with red ochre pigment on light-colored clay, showing a goat leaping toward a tree and eating its leaves in progressive stages of movement. When the goblet is slowly rotated, the images succeed one another in sequence, creating an illusion of fluid movement, exactly like the principle of a flipbook or a zoetrope. It was, and is still recognized as, the oldest example of animation in the world. More than 5,000 years before Disney, before the flip books of the 19th century, before the magic lanterns of the 17th century, someone in Share-e-Sukte intuitively understood the principle of image sequences to create the visual perception of movement. More than decorative artisans, the creators of that goblet were visual storytellers, inventors, and perhaps the first animators in human history. Today, that goblet is on display at the National Museum of Iran in Tehran as one of the most precious and visited pieces in the collection. At the same site, they found the oldest complete board game in the world, a kind of backgammon with 4 carved dice and 27 perfectly preserved geometric pieces. They also found a ruler with half-millimeter precision, whose accuracy still impresses contemporary engineers and metrologists. They found a system of pipes that archaeologists believe was part of an organized water supply or sewage disposal network, something extremely rare in any Bronze Age city. They found cylindrical and flat seals used to mark goods and commercial documents, indicating large-scale trade with distant civilizations. And they found an accounting tablet that is one of the oldest ever recorded in history, with linear marks indicating the type of product transported and rectangular marks representing numerical quantities. More than 2 million individual pieces were collected from the labyrinthine sequences of rooms that remained miraculously intact under the salt for millennia. 2 million pieces, and the excavation has not yet covered even half of the total archaeological site. But perhaps the most bewildering aspect of Share-e-Sukte is not what they found inside it. It is what they never found. In no excavation, in no tomb, in no corner of this 200-hectare city, in no stratigraphic layer of any of the 4 periods of occupation was a single weapon found. No sword, no spear, no dagger, no arrowhead, no shield, no armor, no evidence of war, armed conflict, or military defense. The city had no walls, it had no watchtowers, it had no moats. In a world where every contemporary civilization was building ever higher walls, forging ever sharper swords, and celebrating military conquests on grandiose stone reliefs, Share-e-Sukte existed without any of those things, nor were palaces or differentiated royal tombs found. No clear sign of a dynastic ruling class or hereditary centralized authority. No monumental temple or grandiose religious structure, no idol of worship, no altar suggesting organized worship of deities. In an era when kings carved their names in stone for eternity and gods demanded bloody offerings in colossal temples, Share-e-Sukte stood as a city with no visible throne, no imposed hierarchy, and no declared divine intermediaries. Researchers came to call it, with good reason, the City of Peace, the City of Art, and the City of Science, each nickname capturing a different facet of a society that fits absolutely no conventional model of ancient civilization. And there is more. Detailed paleoanthropological studies revealed that women had a central and prominent role in the social and economic life of the city. Inside some female tombs, specific types of insignia and ceremonial objects were found that distinguished prominent members of the community, and these status markers appeared exclusively in women's burials. In an era when, in most known civilizations of the Middle East, women were treated as the property of men, in Share-e-Sukte they bore the symbols of power and social prestige. Skeletons of professional messengers were also identified, including a camel with signs of constant riding, suggesting a mail system that transported packages and messages over long distances. The city's economy was fueled by a trade network that extended thousands of kilometers in every possible direction. Share-e-Sukte sat at the strategic crossroads of Bronze Age trade routes that traversed the Iranian plateau, connecting Mesopotamia to Central Asia, the Indus Valley to the Persian Gulf. The city's position on the banks of the Helmand River near the borders of modern Afghanistan and Pakistan, transformed it into a key transshipment point for luxury goods crossing half a continent. And here enters one of the most fascinating chapters in the story of this impossible city. The industrial quarters of Shah-e-Sukhteh constituted the economic core of the metropolis, demonstrating a remarkable level of technological specialization that sustained its prosperity. The workshops in the northwest of the city contained extensive evidence of lapis lazuli processing, a deep, intensely blue, semi-precious stone imported from the mines of Badakhshan in northern Afghanistan through routes that crossed hundreds of kilometers of hostile terrain. The artisans of the burnt city transformed the raw material into finished beads and luxury objects with impressive technical mastery. Processing workshops discovered by the Italian team in 1972 contained enormous concentrations of flint, lapis lazuli and turquoise in quantities considered unique across the entire region. And do you know what researchers discovered when comparing the finds? That semi-finished items found in Shah-e-Sukhteh were identical to pieces discovered in the legendary Royal Cemetery of Ur in Mesopotamia, one of the richest funerary sites of antiquity. This means that the burnt city was, literally, the factory that processed and supplied the Sumerian elites with their most coveted luxury objects. 90% of the lapis lazuli found at the site was raw material or industrial processing residue. Only 10% were finished products. The city was not merely a consumer of precious stones, it was the industrial heart of a supply chain that stretched across half the ancient world, from Afghanistan to Sumer. Beyond lapis lazuli, the artisans produced refined objects of agate, turquoise, chalcedony and flint, and there was consistent evidence of advanced copper metallurgy. The city exported carved chlorite vessels with elaborate motifs of scorpions, eagles, bulls, and mythological hybrid creatures. Wool textiles produced from local pastoral resources contributed to exports as high-value goods. The combination of all this specialized production reflects a sophisticated economic system with a clear division of labor and organized access to resources from multiple geographical origins. The city experienced 4 main periods of civilization. During period 1, around 3200 before Christ, it already maintained close connections with sites in southern Turkmenistan, with the Kandahar region in Afghanistan, the Quetta Valley in Pakistan, and the Bampur Valley in Iran itself, as well as connections with the Proto-Elamite cities of Khuzestan and Fars. In period 2, starting around 3000 before Christ, the city came into direct contact with the pre-Harappan centers of the Indus Valley, drastically expanding its network of influence. In period 3, between 2700 and 2400 before Christ, the city reached its maximum extent of nearly 200 hectares, and the lapis lazuli workshops operated on an industrial scale without precedent. And then the world began to change, and with it, the city. Period 4, around 2400 to 2300 before Christ, was marked by progressive isolation and the contraction of the trade network. Connections were reduced almost exclusively to the Bampur Valley and the Kandahar area. Recent excavations by Italian archaeologist Enrico Ascaloni in Area 33 revealed an abandonment phase radiocarbon dated to between 2450 and 2350 before Christ. Archaeologist Massimo Vidale, at a conference in 2021, stated that the functional urban system of Shah-e-Sukhteh did not survive beyond 2350 before Christ. The so-called Burnt Palace, the largest structure in the eastern residential neighborhood, was destroyed by a devastating fire around 2200 before Christ, the most violent of the 3 fires the city endured. But what caused the final collapse? The answer is not in war, it is not in invasion, it is in climate. The region that today houses the Lut Desert, officially measured as one of the hottest places on the surface of the Earth, was completely different 5,000 years ago. Lake Hamoun, near which the city was built, was vastly larger than any remnant that survives today, fed by the perennial waters of the Helmand River. There were extensive swamps, dense vegetation, diverse wildlife. But over centuries, the watercourses began to shift for geological and climatic reasons. The climate became progressively hotter and drier. Agriculture became unsustainable as irrigation failed. Productivity plummeted, livestock diminished, and the population, with no alternative, simply departed in migratory waves that spread across the region. It was not an invasion. It was not an epic battle. There were no conquerors marching over the walls, because there were no walls. The most peaceful city of the ancient world was not destroyed by war. It was suffocated by drought. The rivers changed course. The lake shrank until it became a salt stain. The irrigation canals that for centuries had carried life to every corner of the plain went dry and cracked. And a civilization that depended on water for absolutely everything found itself slowly strangled by the desert that would eventually swallow it completely. After the last fire, there was no more rebuilding. The remaining inhabitants left. And for the following 4,000 years, 20 centimeters of ash and dust sealed absolutely everything. The extreme arid climate of the region did the preservation work that no museum in the world could replicate. Where moisture would destroy organic materials, the desert preserved them. Under the salt and the ash, the rooms remained intact with their objects exactly where they had been left, like a frozen snapshot of the last day of a civilization. Today, Share Sukte has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 2014, officially recognized as one of the most important archaeological sites on the planet. Iranian and international teams continue to work at the site, and new discoveries are reported periodically. A clay Elamite tablet was recently unearthed, opening unprecedented perspectives on the city's linguistic and cultural connections with neighboring civilizations. The University of Salento in Italy recently held a cultural meeting dedicated to the burnt city, keeping alive the Italian research tradition that began with Tosi decades ago. But despite more than half a century of excavations, less than half of Share Sukte has been investigated. Beneath the whitish hills of the Sistan Desert, there are still hundreds of untouched rooms, thousands of sealed tombs, artifacts that no human being has seen in the last 5,000 years. Each excavation season reveals more pieces of the puzzle, but the complete picture remains stubbornly out of reach. And the deepest enigma of all is perhaps none of the individual discoveries. It is not the golden eye. It is not the oldest animation in the world. It is not the brain surgery on a 13-year-old girl or the perfectly preserved board game. The true enigma is how a civilization so advanced, so technologically sophisticated, so creative in art, so bold in medicine, could exist for more than 1,000 years without any of the things that every history book says are essential to keep a complex society running. Without kings, without armies, without temples, without any apparent hierarchy of power, without visible institutional coercion. How did it work? Who made the decisions? How did they resolve conflicts in a metropolis of tens of thousands of inhabitants? How did they maintain order without any structure of force? And despite decades of excavation and millions of analyzed artifacts, modern science still has no answers to these fundamental questions. Because Share Sukte left no texts, it left no inscriptions, it did not carve names on monuments. The oldest writing found in the region belongs to the neighboring Jiroft culture, and to this day, no linguist in the world has managed to decipher it. Everything we know about the burnt city comes exclusively from the objects, from the painted ceramics, from the worked bones, from the sculpted stones, from the mud walls, from the deafening silence of a site where absolutely everything was preserved except the words. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know the name of the tall woman who wore the golden eye her entire life. We do not know who the surgeon was, who opened a child's skull and kept her alive. We do not know who painted the goblet with the leaping goat that became the first animation in human history. And we do not know who decided that City would exist without kings, without weapons, and without visible gods, in a world where every other civilization considered those three things absolutely indispensable. The city keeps its final secret. And perhaps that is precisely what makes it eternal. Not the mystery of how it was built, not the astonishment caused by its impossible inventions, but the silent mystery of who these people were, who 5,000 years ago, in the middle of a world torn apart by perpetual wars, chose to build an entire civilization on the pillars of art, science, and peace. And then, when the land dried up and the rivers changed course, they departed without leaving a single word to explain why.